This is a reading from Modern Saints by Anne Ball. Chapter 35. Venerable Charles de Foucault, little brother Charles of Jesus, Charles Eugene Vicomte de Foucault, born 1858 in France and died 1916 in Algeria at the age of 58. In his mid-20s, Viscount Charles de Foucault thought that the best part of life consisted in shocking the little French town where he was stationed as a second lieutenant in the French army. He tried in every way to shock the people, both with his extravagant spending and his wild behavior. Having inherited a fortune from his maternal grandfather, Charles was able to indulge any whim of self-gratification. Greatly attracted to women, he told each of his new mistresses, "I rent by the day, not by the month." No one who knew him at this time suspected that the playboy would one day give up all worldly pleasures for the love of God. The thought that he, like the desert fathers of early Christian times, might eventually be attracted to a life of serving God as a hermit in the desert would have amazed his contemporaries. Charles was left an orphan by the age of 6, and he and his sister were brought up by their grandfather. By the time he was 15, less than a year after his first communion, Charles had ceased to be a Christian and was an agnostic. At school, he did so little work that he was expelled. For a few months, he studied hard in order to be admitted to St. Cyr, a military school, but he became so lazy that he grew fat, and by the entrance date, no uniform could be found to fit him. He had to have one specially tailored. At age 17, he was, in his own words, all egoism, vanity, impiety, and evil-doing. In 1878, his grandfather died. Love for the old man had prevented Charles from indulging in the worst excesses, but at his death, Charles began to live. On receiving his inheritance, he set about spending it in riotous living. In 1880, his regiment was sent to Algeria. Charles took with him one of his numerous mistresses and lived in such blatant dissipation that he was suspended from the army. Soon, though, an insurrection broke out in Algeria. He revolunteered and was reinstated. After 8 months of active service in which the young soldier fought bravely and well, he resigned his commission. For the next year, he traveled through Morocco, exploring and taking such excellent notes that on his return he wrote 2 books, which won for him a gold medal from the French Geographical Society in 1885. Back in France, however, Charles returned to his old life of self-indulgence. For a time, he lived in Paris, where he took an apartment near a cousin, Marie de Bondy. Mary, who had first entered his life when he was about 11, was a deeply spiritual young woman. Gradually, through her example, the gay and reckless young man began to change. Realizing the devoutness of his cousin and knowing her intelligence, Charles began to question whether religion was truly the fairy tale he had thought it. He began to go to church, praying that God would make himself known to him. Finally came his dramatic return to the sacraments. His religion, when he rediscovered God, was a highly personal discipleship and love of the person of Jesus Christ. Regarding his conversion, Charles said, "The moment I realized that God existed, I knew I could not do otherwise than to live for him alone." Marie had felt that the best means of converting a person was to show him that one loved him, a concept that Charles was to remember later and make a large part of his life. Between Charles and this cousin, who was 8 years older, grew a spiritual friendship that was to last until his death. The fact that Marie never scolded him, attempting to win him only by her example, led Charles to the idea of an apostolate for a new order in the church, an apostolate of presence, not preaching. Before his return to France, Charles had become engaged to the daughter of a prominent French geographer in Algeria. This fiancée later testified and gave evidence to the postulator of his cause. The young woman was a Catholic convert, but after the engagement was broken, she was brokenhearted and left her religion. In 1913, Charles and his ex-fiancée met by chance on the street of Algiers. She was a married woman, and he was a priest. At this meeting, she informed them that she had left the church. Feeling that her leaving was his fault, Charles prayed for her, and in time she did return to the practice of her Catholic faith. At the age of 65, 10 years after the death of Charles de Foucault, this woman told the postulator of his cause, "I have pined for him all my life, and I loved him and will love him until my dying day." For a time after his return to the sacraments, Charles lived as a Trappist monk. Although he is remembered as an exemplary religious, the conviction grew that this was not his vocation. Charles felt that God's will for him lay elsewhere, although his advisor felt that he should remain a Trappist. The decision, however, was in the hands of the superiors of the order. At the end of January, the Father General of the order told Charles to leave the order, the better to follow Christ in abjection and poverty. In February of that same year, 1897, he was to have taken his final vows as a Trappist. After being released from his temporary vows, Charles went to the Holy Land, where he became a servant for the poor Clare nuns, living in a small room near their monastery. He spoke to no one except in the line of duty, often slept outside on the ground, and ate frugally. He worked as a gardener and handyman for the sisters, only one of whom, the superior, knew who he was. Rumors about the handyman with the cultured voice and manners began to fly. When at last a gossipy man from town inquired if it was true that in France he held the title of Count, Charles smilingly replied, "I'm an old soldier," avoiding the actual question. Mother Elizabeth, the superior of these Clarist sisters, was a woman of uncommon wisdom. She helped Charles to the realization that he should become a priest in order to serve God better. Charles wished to remain hidden, living a poor, unknown life, but his confessor and Mother Elizabeth won out, and Charles finished his studies for the priesthood and was ordained in 1901. Later that year, he left for Algeria to take up the life of a hermit in the desert. In the desert, one thing became increasingly clear to Father de Foucault. Neither the Mohammedans nor the pagans of Africa were yet ready to be converted. Ignorance and prejudice were too great for that. He must live in such a way as to make himself a personal example to these people. He would make the first personal contacts that later, much later, would lead to conversions. Little Brother Charles of Jesus, as he called himself, thought up and wrote down a plan for 2 religious orders. The members of these orders would live a life patterned on the life of Jesus at Nazareth. They would go and live among the world's poor, sharing all they had, working each day for a living. They would teach only by the example of living a good Christian life in small groups of 3 to 5. At the time of Brother Charles's death, neither his missionary contacts nor his designs for new religious orders had borne visible fruit. In 10 years in the desert, he had not made a single convert, although many of the natives who knew him were devoted to him and thought of him as a holy man. His plans for new orders had not been carried out. The only recruit who came to join him left after only a short while. In 1916, living among the fierce Tuaregs of Tamanrasset, Charles de Foucault was murdered in an attempt to warn 2 Arab soldiers of danger from a group of Senussi rebels. On the evening of December the 1st, Charles was called out of his house by a familiar voice. Outside, he realized that he had been betrayed, and he was seized by a group of rebels. Leaving a 15-year-old boy to guard him, they began to ransack the building. Suddenly, 2 Arab horsemen were sighted. The captive priest made a gesture to warn them off, and the boy panicked and shot. Little Brother Charles was dead instantly, with a bullet in his brain. 3 weeks later, the monstrance with the host before which Brother Charles had been praying when the marauders appeared was found in the sand, where they had tossed it as a useless object. The life of Charles de Foucault was like the biblical seed which had to die before it sprouted into a healthy plant. Within 20 years after his death, there appeared 3 congregations which derived their inspiration, purpose, and rules from Charles de Foucault. These little brothers of Jesus, little sisters of the Sacred Heart, and little sisters of Jesus lived in small groups all over the world, preaching by the lives they led. 2 other orders, founded later, traced their heritage to Little Brother Charles of Jesus. Each of these groups bases its apostolate on the ideas of the order which the martyr of the desert had planned, but did not live to see. A brief resume of the ideals of the Little Brothers of Jesus, founded in 1933, will give an idea of the basis for all 5 orders. The brothers have an apostolate of presence rather than of preaching. They live among men and witness to Christ by their actions rather than their words. For the brothers, nothing takes precedence over prayer. They do not take over the leadership of social or civic works, but band together for a life of shared Christian prayer. When a fraternity comes to an area, the little brothers do not bring jobs, skills, teachers, or other benefits provided by other orders of the church. They have an apostolate of personal friendship. Their mission is to be friends and make friends, to share the friendship of Jesus Christ. The brothers' homes and their clothes, except for a badge, are the type common to the people among whom they live. Their work does not separate them from the environment they have chosen. Finally, the brothers live a life of poverty rather than security. The need for their type of Christian witness is especially great among the poor and the least favored. They could not share the work and social conditions of their neighbors without being committed to the poverty and uncertainty of such a life. As a part of their family responsibility, each fraternity contributes out of its earnings to the education of the congregation's candidates. The Little Sisters of Jesus are also based on the above ideals. They consider themselves contemplatives in the world. Knowledge of the life of Charles de Foucault has spread throughout the Church. After preliminary investigations, all proved positive, and he was declared venerable on April the 13th, 1978. Here are some pictures of him. Caption reads, "The photograph of the young Viscount Charles de Foucault shows the willfulness he displayed for the most of his early life. Charles de Foucault at age 6. By age 15, he was an agnostic." The rich young libertine told each of his new mistresses, "I rent by the day, not by the month." Charles de Foucault was expelled from school for not doing his work, and later was suspended from the French army in Algeria because of his dissipated life. Here he is later in life. Gradually, through the example of his cousin Marie, an intelligent and deeply spiritual young woman, the reckless Charles began to regain his faith. Regarding his conversion, Charles de Foucault said, "The moment I realized that God existed, I knew I could not do otherwise than live for him alone." Left. After his conversion, Charles, on the right, took up the life of a hermit. He made himself a simple habit patterned after the common dress of his neighbors in the desert, adding a badge showing the cross and heart. Right. Venerable Charles de Foucault, the hermit of the desert, in his homemade habit. Charles de Foucault with Paul Bonifa and little Abd Jesus, servant of Jesus. Known as Little Brother Charles of Jesus, Charles de Foucault was killed at the age of 58. At that time, he was living in Tamanrasset, Algeria. And here he is towards the end of his life. The face of Venerable Charles de Foucault bears witness to his great transformation of soul.